Our final speaker for tonight is Deborah Ball from the University of Michigan.
Good evening. This is quite a slot to give somebody from the East Coast, since it's now 10:45 p.m. according to my computer. But I am going to try to connect across some of the things we've been talking about so far today by making an argument that it sort of reinforces and I think extends and I hope provokes you a bit about the Common Core and its relationship to teacher education. I've titled my talk, Learning to Teach Something in Particular, a Common Core for the Training of Teachers. And you can question me about why I'm using the word training. I'm happy to answer it, but it's quite deliberate. The top heading of this title is a play on a title of an article that was in the American Educator in January of this year, written by my colleague David Cohen, in which he argued that one of the principal problems of American teacher education is that we teach people to teach nothing in particular. In other words, the lack of a common curriculum in this country has been one of the principal impediments to building a real system in which teachers would actually be prepared to do the work we're asking them to do. That this is unlike almost any other country in the world with which we compare ourselves. And the fact that when I teach a math content course or math methods course, I have absolutely no idea precisely what the content is or the curriculum that my teachers will go out to teach is an enormous impediment that we're all so used to that we don't even think about it. And so therefore, the advent of the Common Core standards or something like them, as Bill has been arguing, the very commonness of it offers us an opportunity. So I've titled this, along with my colleague Francesca Forzani, what we might be able to say, given the Common Core state standards, that is that we would actually be helping people learn to teach something in particular rather than nothing in particular. The things I'll draw upon in this talk grow from work of many people who are colleagues of mine at the University of Michigan, including Megan Shaughnessy and Hai Bass, who are both here at this conference. But I didn't want to talk about this work without acknowledging that it is the product of many faculty and postdocs at Michigan who are currently engaged in trying to think about what it would mean to make a common core for the professional training of teachers. So the headlines of what I want to say are three things, really. The Common Core, and not just the Common Core, but also something that only some of you are probably familiar with, which is an organization of standards for the professional training of teachers put out by the Council of Chief State School Officers called the INTESC standards. And the growing interest, as represented by a recent report about clinical training of teachers, are all enormous resources for actually stepping up for the first time and building something you might actually consider to be a system for the way that we prepare people to be teachers in this country. But to do that, two things would have to happen, which is what I want to concentrate. First of all, if we were going to realize the potential of what the CCSS provides us in terms of fundamentally changing and making a real system, as I'm arguing, we would have to completely rebuild the curriculum for learning to teach in this country. And that would include not only what we teach people who are preparing to be teachers, and I'm concentrating at the moment in these comments on the initial preparation of teachers, but my argument applies, and you can extend it to talk about the continuing education of professionals. It would not only mean what we teach and agreeing upon that in the way that we've labored to try to agree about that about mathematics, but it would also mean working together on new approaches to how you actually train people to do the work of teaching and new forms of assessment about whether people are capable of being allowed to be responsible for children's learning. And to do that would require still something else that many people in this room are interested in, Diane among them, which is the capability of those people whom we ask to teach teachers to do this work. Teacher educator is a really imperfect word for the people I mean, because some of the people who work with teachers are called teacher educators, but some of them are mathematicians. Some of them are teacher leaders in school districts, and on and on. So I'm talking about all of those people. If we were going to have a fundamentally different approach to the way we help people learn to do this complicated work, those people too would have new things to learn. Now, to make my point, I want to step outside of teaching and outside of mathematics for a moment and just challenge you by pointing out something about two entirely different trades in this country, one a skilled trade and one a profession. And I want you to notice how different this is than anything that we see in teaching and teacher preparation. So I'm going to start with plumbing. Here are some examples of the things that people who learn to become plumbers have to learn to do. Notice how detailed they are and how specific. And you don't actually get a plumber's license until you can perform these things, that you know how to do them and you can demonstrate that you can do them. My colleagues and I have become interested in this because we've become affiliated with the United Association, who, by the way, have also not only careful standards for who gets to be a plumber, but incredibly rigorous training for anybody who's a master, that is, the people who actually work with apprentices. You don't get to just be a plumber and then, by the way, oh, would you mind having an apprentice work with you? You have 5 years of training before you get to be a master. So the kind of training that plumbers receive in this country includes very detailed performance expectations, a 5-year apprenticeship, and you can see all the other things on this slide. Things that, you know, it's plumbing. It's actually skilled work. We can't do it, most of us, I assume. I at least can't do it. And you know what? When you call up a plumber, you actually assume that the person you're calling can come over and fix whatever it is you called about. And the reason you can assume that is because the training is actually agreed upon about what you have to do and know how to do in order to be a plumber. And I like to pick this because I'm going to now use one that all of us are weary of, which is medical practice. But it's important to see that in both cases, a skilled trade and a profession, the story is very different than teaching. So here's an example of some of the standards for medical practice. Again, I presume that most of you in this room can't do any of these things. I can't either. But we're pretty glad that when we go to a physician who's going to conduct a chest examination on us, that the person knows how to do those things. And that is actually what people who are learning to become physicians learn to do. And they're assessed on those things. Here's an interesting picture of the kind of careful clinical practice and training that medical students get when they are preparing to be physicians. Notice in this picture, which comes from the New York Times about a couple of years ago, how the attending physician not only is helping, and you see this as a dummy patient, so they're very carefully used, not always real patients, by the way. You might not want to practice this on real people, but by the way, we do let student teachers practice all the time on real children, and we think that's fine. But also notice the way the physician has his arms around her, helping her to see how she's to use her hands and what she's supposed to be feeling. What's the analog in teaching? For example, how often have you seen somebody helping a beginning teacher learn how you use physical distance and voice in the way that you approach a child when you're asking questions? You know, we don't talk about it very much. It's fundamentally important. And people like I, who have taught for a long time, control that kind of thing a lot. And I bet that the experienced teachers in the room know exactly what I mean. Who you can stoop by, how you talk to them, tone of voice, all kinds of things that actually would require a similar and analogous kind of guidance. So my point, which I guess you can see me leading up to, is that there's no equivalent for this whatsoever in teaching. The kind of objectives that we have for student teaching and for the kind of coursework are unbelievably vague compared to what I was just showing you. And although you're going to say to me, well, don't they have, you know, practicum every term and don't they have student teaching? Yes, but it's incredibly underspecified compared to what I just showed you by sampling 2 other kinds of occupations. So when you look at standards that are written for teaching practice, you see things like the teacher uses a variety of instructional strategies to engage students in challenging academic content. What? I mean, the analog would be something like the teacher elicits solutions to a geometry task and conducts a discussion comparing the solutions. Or the teacher poses a focused task to engage students in considering how to apply the definition of a fraction. Have you ever seen anything specified in that level of detail in teacher preparation? Not likely. So I'm challenging you to think a bit about this because we're spending a lot of time here talking about something that is absolutely fundamental to changing the nature of mathematics learning in this country, but we won't get the results we want if we aren't also willing to step up and say a very analogous thing needs to happen for the very difficult work of teaching. We need a common core for that as well, and it would be very similar, some agreement on what are the most fundamental things that people who are asked to do this very complicated, responsible work would need to be able to do. We're really fond of looking at other countries, and we have Teresa Tato here who will talk about some of the work that looks at that. But I might point out that when we look to other countries, and I think Zhao may back me up or not on this, we tend to cherry pick a lot. We tend to pick the things that we'd like to pay attention to about other systems, but I'd like you to pay attention to a couple of things that relate to my argument. One is that in, for example, these other democracies, which manage democracy while also managing somehow to have some agreements about education, they have, as the gentleman from Sweden mentioned of his country, common K-12 curricula and exams that are about that curriculum. About that curriculum. The testing we do in this country isn't related to the curriculum. We did that on purpose. So We have a lot of testing that we complain a lot. It's not over what students are being taught. It's deliberately abstracted from the curriculum. In these other countries, people who are learning to teach study that curriculum in detail and practice how to teach it. That sounds pretty different. And the inspection systems, which is the word given to the way teachers are supervised, the way teaching practice is evaluated, works on teachers' instructional capability in reference to that common curriculum. So, not to sound so sharp about everything, it could be actually the dawn of a new moment in this country. We have, and I think it's already been eloquently explained what this offers us, the very notion of common, not just what these standards are, as Bill said, but the very idea that there is this agreement. There's also, sort of complementing this, the most widespread agreement I've ever seen that teaching instruction actually is fundamental to the achievement of students. You know, I've lived through, as most of you have, probably 30 years where we thought, oh, assessments will do it, standards will do it, oh, something else will do it, but accountability will do it. There is substantial evidence right now about teacher effects, even individual teacher effects. So in a single school building, two teachers with the same community, the same issues, the same sort of resource problems, produce entirely different achievement gains for parallel groups of students. Very interesting and also very hopeful because, you know, as much as we all worry deeply about the huge social inequalities in this country, that actually prevents a lot of hope that investing in providing professionals with the skills it takes to be that kind of teacher who can produce a lot of gains as opposed to the other is worth investing in. If that weren't true, it would be a lot less hopeful. But the fact that individual teachers have the kind of effects on student learning gains that they do, as we see in research, Amy, since Amy's worrying that there's never research, this is actually very durable research. No, this is different than what you asked. I'm just saying sometimes this research really helps us a lot, and it's interesting to see the power of teacher effects.
Data helps.
You're right, exactly. And finally, I think that maybe there is a possible potential agreement that could be forged about the fact that teaching actually isn't something you're born to do. It's not something that you either have or you don't have. And guess what? It's not very productive to just learn it all on the job. It's actually something you can teach people to do. But these are radically not accepted ideas for the most part in American professional culture. So I'm hoping to sort of bootstrap and carry along an argument along with the struggles we're having over pushing along the English language arts and mathematics Common Core to say, let's just go one step further and say, if we're really going to do this right, let's do it right now, and let's talk about what it would mean to have a Common Core for the professional training of teachers. So I want to articulate a few problems that would be required to face if we were going to do this, and this goes back to something that Denise started us with tonight when she said, you know, we talk a lot about this idea of more practice-based teacher education, so what would be the problems? One would be that we lack a common and precise enough language. Susan Joe said earlier, I think more in reference to mathematics, but it would be true of teaching practice as well, that we don't really have a very good way to parse the work. We don't have very good names for it. My best example would be questions, which somebody, I guess Denise mentioned, hugely important in teaching practice. We have almost no vocabulary to distinguish questions. You would think we might have, 50 or 60 different terms to distinguish the kinds of questions that teachers use, but actually we have something like higher order, lower order, I don't know, open-ended, closed question. It's a really impoverished language when you think questions are one of the key tools that you use. It's surprising there's very little language. And we don't have very good ways of cutting up the practice either. So, teaching a lesson is not breaking down teaching into something that you actually can identify as a kind of thing to be learned. We don't know what the good grain size would be. There's been a history of breaking down teaching into such tiny little elements that you can hardly imagine reassembling it into real teaching. So how big or small should these things be that would be in the Common Core for teaching? There's the problem that, some aspects of teaching actually, aren't really content specific. They're actually kind of more general. There are things that good teachers do every day across subject matters that are really important to know how to do well. For example, if you're a high school teacher, knowing how to kind of hang out a bit in the hall between classes and make some contact that's personal with kids is an important skill for a high school teacher, and it doesn't have too much to do whether you're the English teacher or the history teacher. But there also are things that are very subject specific, and we're not so clear about which are which. We also like to think that everything about teaching is local and contextualized in particular, but actually, any of you who has, as I have, taught across many different levels and subjects will recognize that there are practices and skills that we're using, whether the kids are third graders or they're graduate students or they're practicing teachers. So sorting out, and whether they live in Alabama or they live in urban Detroit, you know, sorting out which of these things is actually contextual and isn't is another challenge here. It would be important, as we worked on this, to figure out which things we're willing to say are actually highly routine and repetitive, that come up all the time, and work on those in the Common Core before we worried about all the really cool, very unusual, mysterious things that kids will do or that come up in teaching. There is stuff like that. But I don't know what my colleagues who have taught longer than I have in the room would be willing to estimate, but I'd be willing to estimate a very high percentage of things that are pretty predictable, that are like physicians called textbook cases, things that you know are going to happen, things that happen when you teach fourth graders English or reading or math. And we'd have to figure out which are which, because it would be probably more sensible to invest in some of those more predictable things so that every person who becomes a teacher doesn't have to go out into a classroom and say, you know, why are my kids getting problems when we subtract numbers that require regrouping? Like, why are they subtracting up? Like, no one should have to go out and discover that. It's really predictable that that's what little kids will do. So, you know, that would be a math-specific example, but there are lots of other examples as well. And finally, we'd have to figure out what's most worth putting into a Common Core. What are kids most at risk for when teachers are bumbling along trying to figure this out on their own when we could actually teach it? And which things either have to be learned sort of from experience or are just as easily learned from experience or over time. So these are some of the challenges. So at Michigan, what we've been trying to do, and I know there are people in other parts of the country also doing this, is trying to identify what we call high leverage practices. Think of these as an answer to what was on the previous slide. So to do that, we've tried to get people with all different kinds of expertise, teachers, people who study teaching, and so on, just to try to figure out, you know, if you built a map of all of the work of teaching and tried to name the things that people do who teach, what would that map look like? And then tried to figure out which of those things would be most important for beginners to actually be good at. That's undoubtedly similar to what you had to do to figure out, you know, if you're going to make a Common Core about mathematics, what are the things that have to be named at what grade size and why are they so fundamental to name? And then you would have to deliberately choose those tasks and activities that would be useful in trying to build this Common Core of curriculum. So why we chose this name high leverage was to say what we mean by high leverage practices is those things that when teachers can do them well, they powerfully promote student learning and are fundamental to being a competent and responsible beginning teacher. They are the things you should have to do before someone lets you have a classroom on your own. But we also complemented it, and this is where we get back to the Common Core, by saying if we have the Common Core, let's also say which are the topics and mathematical practices, or whatever the new term will be that puts these together, or whatever, that are most crucial and really dangerous when teachers don't have the kind of mathematical knowledge for teaching around these things that they would need to have to teach. So, you know, are there topics in the elementary curriculum, for example, and particular mathematical practices that you'd be deeply uncomfortable if your child was in a classroom with a first-year teacher and that person had really not had any chance to really rebuild their understanding? And are you complementary able to say that there are some topics in the Common Core that you'd be comfortable if that teacher wasn't really, really skillful with at the beginning? Because it's not possible to think that people will be able to be licensed to be independently practicing and know everything in the Common Core. So the high leverage content is a similar problem. So just to give you some examples, these might constitute examples at a grain size and responsive to the criteria that I'm suggesting. So these are things that come up routinely. They're really pretty risky when people don't know how to do them. They are things that people can be taught to do. But they're not meant to be an exhaustive or list. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the kind of thing I mean. And you can see that these are stated generically. So another piece is to respond to the question of how do you then color these in a sense, to match in particular content, in our case, since we're interested in math, with math. Like conducting a meeting with a parent or whoever the caregiver is for a child. I think any of you who has taught, like I did, probably a day doesn't go by that you don't talk to someone who's in the home or wherever the child is living. Almost never is that part of any professional training. Kind of shocking. And yet it takes a terrific amount of skill. And imagine when you're trying to explain to a parent why the child is having difficulty with particular mathematics. There's actually content involved as well. Because the way you would talk to a parent about a problem with multiplication isn't the same way you would talk to the child or to a colleague. So what is involved in helping a parent understand what the child's difficulty is? So some nominations of where you might pick some of the high leverage content. I'm not arguing for these, but just again to figure out, like, how would you make the argument? You could make the argument that these are the things that are really risky if elementary teachers can't. And when I don't mean here like they just can do the problems, like Denise said, but these would be the things where they had demonstrated the kind of unpacked and flexible mathematical knowledge for teaching that many of us have talked about and studied. Or, which of the mathematical practices are so fundamentally tied into helping young people learn that you would want teachers to actually have had opportunity to become rather skilled with those and flexible and fluent with what it means to model mathematical ideas or construct arguments and engage others in criticizing them. So, piece of my argument here is to say, if we were going to build a common core for teaching, we'd have to argue about the what. So everything up to this point starts that argument and gives some illustrations of how you could answer the what part. But that wouldn't be all we'd have to do, because to improve the non-system that we have, we'd also have to develop new methods for teaching practice. And here, the gerund is possibly confusing. I mean the teaching of practice. In other words, the teaching of teaching practice. So here you see a photo of Magdalene Lampert, my colleague. It's kind of an interesting photo because that guy, who's an intern teacher, you see him also on the video. Kind of like an piece of art. And this group of intern teachers and Magdalene are discussing in detail this intern's lesson and discussing something about the way he managed the situation. So it's just an illustration of a kind of much more careful teaching of teaching practice. And of course, this isn't new at all. If there's any way that anybody ever learned to teach, it was through experience. So the idea that we would be trying to work on a practice more isn't new. Student teaching has forever, as long as I can remember in the 20th century, was part of teacher education. And most programs, including alternative routes like Teach for America and higher ed programs, include substantial amounts of time in the field. So what I'm really talking about is a common core for teaching would have to be more than how much time are people in the field and just believing that being out there is somehow how you learn. It would have to be a lot more explicit. So if you take the things I was arguing earlier about specific teaching practices tied to content, you would also then need to think about how do you specifically help people to learn those things, not just have them having experience. So the core components of this common core of a practice-centered approach to training teachers would have three things. One would be the curriculum, which I've sketched. A second would be, what would be the specific approaches and activities? Diane talked about some, but what are the specific, for example, if you're going to teach someone to lead a discussion examining multiple solutions to a math problem, and you really want to break that down and teach them to do that, what is the sequence of real experience in a school, watching a video, possibly rehearsing it with colleagues? What is the instructional sequence to take someone who has never conducted a discussion with a group of second graders about a math problem and takes them through a sequence whereby after multiple times through that sequence, they could pass a performance assessment that would satisfy Denise that they should be allowed to be out in a classroom handling mathematics problems and discussions about them. So that's what I mean by designing the instructional sequence. It's more than saying conducting a whole class discussion of a math problem is a core. It would be, what do we actually understand about how you teach people to do that? And it's presumably different than how you teach people to do another one on my list, which was recognizing common patterns of student thinking, interpreting them, and being able to identify the most probable next instructional move. That's probably a different instructional sequence for the learning teacher than the other one is. So how would we figure out what these different approaches were? And we know some things about this, but organizing a core for the professional training of teachers would take us into that question as well. Finally, we would also have to build an assessment system, because if we were serious about what you can hear me arguing, which is that we wouldn't want people in classrooms responsible for children any more than we would want the medical student conducting chest exams or other things just as a means of learning, and we wouldn't want pilots flying planes as a means of figuring out if they can fly, we should take a position that it's not okay to be learning fundamental aspects of teaching on real children. But that would mean we would need an assessment system to determine when somebody really has the capabilities that should enable them to be a beginning teacher with real children. So what would be some of those things? It would have to measure different aspects of teaching practice. And the warrants for this, sort of why would we know to pick certain things and not others? The warrants, why we would pick them, would have to include what good practicing teachers who have been able to show that they can really help kids learn, what they think these things should look like. It would have to be from the research we've done in particular areas. It would have to be logical. All those things would count. So an example of logic, what I mean by that is, I'm not waiting for any research to tell me that a teacher should be able to conduct a sensible and respectful conversation with a parent. I don't need research to know that. That is part of the work. So it's logical that you don't want people in classrooms who can't do that respectfully and effectively. But something like, exactly what are the common patterns of student thinking that beginning teachers ought to be familiar with, and what are some of the responses that are most probably helpful? We have research on that, and the sort of details of those assessments should be based on that. These assessments should be, through a very serious program of research and development, be tied directly to student learning gains. So we can see over time that teachers' performance on particular assessments predicts that they'll be effective with helping kids learn. It should be obviously geared directly to the Common Core state standards, and that means that they should be content specific. So unlike portfolio assessments where teachers build a portfolio over whatever they felt like teaching, we would actually say you have to demonstrate that you can lead a class discussion about fraction problems on the number line, and we'd probably specify it more than that. So it would be actually about particular content and particular teaching. These assessments, to be good, should offer diagnostic information that help teachers continue to improve their work and the people with whom they work. And to be really helpful, like most other forms of assessment, there should be detailed exemplars of what really good performance on them looks like. What does it look like when a beginning teacher actually is good at leading a classroom discussion of a math problem? What should be the standard? It doesn't look presumably like the accomplished people in this room. So what does very good first-year teaching look like when somebody can lead a discussion? What kinds of things should somebody be able to identify as common patterns of student thinking? And what kind of things how flexibly and fluently should they be able to do that? Recently, and I'm going to just give one example, we used at the end of the first year of our teacher education program some problems that are, I think, similar to the ones Denise was showing. Here's one example of something we tried. This isn't actually the exact same math problem because I don't want to show that one, but it's the same principle. We showed a math problem to interns, one at a time, and some of us, we adopted the standardized patient protocol from medical training. So we were children, some of us, people who were experienced at working with children, and we were sitting there and the intern had to ask questions about our work until the intern felt that she or he understood what our thinking was sufficiently to understand whether or not we understood the math and to be able to predict how we would solve a second problem. So if you look at this right now, you would have to imagine if you're a beginning teacher, what would you ask a child to help you know whether how the child was thinking and whether the child understands the problem? What's interesting about this is that, unless I've made a mistake, which I'm prone to do at this hour, the answer is correct, right? Actually, the way we designed these is the thinking was incorrect. So often when we show interns things, we show them errors. This performance assessment had them looking at a correct answer in which the thinking was flawed. So they asked questions, and as Denise reported, they often did things like, after 2 or 3 questions, assumed that since the answer was right, the child had it right. And then we would say, how do you think the child would do this problem? I'll just go back again. And they all predicted wrongly that the child would put a 2, when in fact the child would put a 1. But they didn't ask enough questions to learn that the child was simply putting a 1 up, because anytime you get a number more than 10, you put a 1 up. They didn't detect that in their questioning, and so when they were shown this problem, they just assumed, oh, the child really gets how to carry, and predicted that the child would get the answer right, when in fact that's what the child did. It was really very interesting, and they made big discrimination among these beginning teachers from those who knew how to ask questions that would get to student thinking rather than putting their own thinking in place. So I do give that really in closing as an example of the kind of concreteness with which the Common Core teaching standards, the Common Core mathematics standards, curriculum standards, and a Common Core of teaching could be married to create a serious professional curriculum for teachers to be prepared to actually teach something in particular. Thank you. probably no time for questions, right?
I think we unfortunately don't have time for questions.
It's really appropriate when I give a provocative talk, then I don't have to answer any questions.
We do have the buses coming.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you in the morning, bright and early.
But it is 8:15. I've used exactly.